Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's TPC training free webinar entitled Effective Safety Culture, Why Contractor Inclusion Matters. We have our resident safety expert here, Paul Colangelo, and he's going to come at you with a bunch of experience, years and years of experience in the safety industry, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about contractors, including them in your overall plan, and how to promote that overall safety culture. Now, before we get started, I want to let you guys know that this is a interactive webinar. So feel free to ask questions as we go. We are coming at you live. And I want to give you some quick instructions on how to do so, how to interact with us here and interact with our experts here. So if you go to your control panel at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see a chat box entitled Chat. When you click on that chat box, you can go ahead and type in a message in that chat box to our panelists. So make sure you're choosing to send that chat message to all panelists. If you choose all panelists and attendees, it'll go to everyone listening, which you probably don't want to do. So if you want to ask specific pointed questions to us, we can make sure to get to those questions by the end of the session. So feel free to ask away. Now, without further ado, I'll give it over to Paul and he can talk to us a little bit about promoting effective safety culture.
Thank you, Ryan. And good afternoon, everyone. It is 3 o'clock on the East Coast, so I think it's safe to say it's afternoon in all time zones. Thank you very much for joining us here today. My goal today is to kind of expand upon this whole safety culture phenomenon that this term has been flying around for the past few years, but I think it's kind of an overused term. If there's any word that I would actually ask you to zero in on, it's effective. When people talk to me about safety culture, usually what I ask them is how effective their safety culture is. And by asking them how effective it is, part of that is how far reaching is their safety culture? Does it reach top to bottom, all employees and supervisors and managers and executives, all locations? And does it reach your contractors, your temp workers, parts of your workforce that are very easy to overlook? So we're going to talk a lot today about some of the things that you should be looking at in terms of contractor inclusion into your overall safety program. And as usual, if you have joined me here in the past for webinars, I try to keep my monologue to about 35 to 45 minutes. That's what I intend. And we're going to leave some room at the end for Q&A. As Ryan mentioned, please feel free to type in questions as we're going, and we will try to get to them at the end. And if for any reason there's a question I can't answer, please leave us your email address, and I will always make every effort to get back to you with an answer to your question. So I just pulled up the session agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about the employment hierarchy that you typically see in the industry. Some regulatory oversight. For today's purposes, we will be focusing on OSHA, but obviously there are other regulatory bodies that play a hand in this. We're going to be talking about pre-qualification and management. Some of the checkpoints you should be looking at for contractors and staffing agencies. We're going to focus a little on training and orientations and how that is such an important step in the process. And we're going to finish up with some contractor management technology, some of the latest and greatest software that's out there that can help you along in this endeavor in both pre-qualification and management. So right off the bat, what I wanted to mention is, not a day goes by in the industry. As Ryan mentioned, I'm coming up on 30 years in environmental health and safety. I've played a lot of roles within the industries of construction, specialized trade, utility, some manufacturing. And it never ceases to amaze me how the harder and harder it gets to self-perform our work, regardless of the industry we're in. I don't care whether it's construction or manufacturing or industrial. I don't know why our safety culture seems to stop at the threshold of our contractors and temp workforce. And I've had this conversation and debate with a lot of my clients through the years. As far back as I can remember in my career, I used to spend a lot of focus on contractors. Just before this webinar kicked off today, I've been following two stories that have been in the news, and I'm sure a lot of you listening in are familiar with them. The first is the Florida International University bridge collapse that happened back in March. Very tragic, multiple fatalities of both workers and the general public. The other one came a month later in Seattle at the Google factory, the Google facility, crane collapse, same thing there. Multiple fatalities and members of the public as well. The interesting thing there is contractors were involved in both of those incidents. And folks, look, accidents happen almost always. Human error is part of it. This can happen to anyone. But I think that the interesting thing here is Florida International University and Google, as the host employers, so to speak, they are now forever linked with these incidents. Even though that, technically they had nothing to do with them. They probably did not have their own employees doing any of this work. But just from a reputation standpoint, from a legacy standpoint, unfortunately now they're linked with these tragedies. And don't get me wrong, these are worst case scenarios. These go far beyond just an injury or an illness or maybe even a single fatality. These are catastrophes that we never want to see. And when they do happen, there tends to be a lot of dissemination on, trying to get to the root cause, how many folks were involved. And over and over again, you see a disconnect, whether it's a disconnect in the safety program, a disconnect in communication, a disconnect in coordination of efforts. So please keep this in mind as we're going through this webinar. So some questions right out of the gate here about your safety culture. I'm imagining if you're joining us today that in some effect, at some level, you do utilize contractors and temp workers. So my question basically is, what does your safety and health pre-qualification and management process include? Are you actually practicing this? Do you include contractors and temp workers in the same sort of standards that you would expect out of your own employees? What I put in bold here is a common question that I ask a lot of my clients, and that is, are you trying to, or are you of the opinion that you can contract away your safety and health compliance responsibilities? And when I say contract away, there are a lot of contracts that are written between host employers and contractors and temp workers and staffing agencies. Don't get me wrong, when it comes to contracts, there's a lot of language you can write into, especially when it comes to the safety and health compliance aspect, where you can hold folks responsible, you can penalize them. There's a lot of things that you can write into it. But I can tell you, if you're looking at this from a regulatory standpoint, well, let me change that. When you're looking at this from a culture standpoint and a regulatory standpoint, neither one of those is just a feasible thing to be able to do. From a safety culture standpoint, just from the life safety aspect, the bottom line is these folks' lives are just as important as your employees. They're part of your family. They perform for your company. The goal is to make your company one of quality and safety. And that's from the culture side of the house. From the regulatory side, you're going to find that regulatory authorities like OSHA, they do not want to see anybody stepping away from their safety and health responsibilities. Whether you're a host employer or a contractor or a staffing agency, you're going to see that there's been a lot of action in the industry over the last few years to make sure that folks are stepping up to those responsibilities. So again, if the life safety factor, doesn't affect you, the question is, doesn't your company reputation hold true with these folks? Again, contractor performance and non-performance has a direct effect on your company reputation and your ability to continue to get work and thrive and prosper with your company. I'm going to present here an OSHA fatal fact. OSHA does have a database of these, and they're actually learning pieces of information that they take real life situations that have happened, and they talk about the incident itself, some of the root causes, some of the findings. I'm going to click on this. So and typically these don't give me much of a problem. Sometimes you never know how long you have to wait when you click on a link, but this is what an OSHA Fatal Fact worksheet looks like. I chose this particular one because it is talking about a temp worker, a 49-year-old male on the job approximately 9 months. Talks about basically what happened. He was killed after falling through a sugar hopper. There's all sorts of information in here that you can share. Again, these are great for things like toolbox talks, tailgate meetings, things of that nature. But if you take a look at the likely causes of the incident, some of the things that jumped right out at me, one of the first ones right there was a corporate safety program, but it wasn't implemented at this work site. So going back to what I just said a minute ago, how far reaching is your safety program? Then, of course, if you come down here to the bottom, it talks about the worker did not receive appropriate safety and health training. And interestingly, his supervisor, who was also a temporary worker, didn't receive training in assessing workplace hazards. So the question is, who was responsible for that? Was it the host employer? Was it the staffing agency? Well, again, there's a lot of information here to digest, but the bottom line is somebody lost their life over it. So I just wanted to present this OSHA Fatal Fact information sheet for you. You can go right to the OSHA website, type in Fatal Facts. There's a lot of these that you can utilize, again, for training your workforce, your contractors, your temp workers on. I find these things very helpful, as tragic as it is to find out that somebody actually had to lose their life for this information to be brought forth. Let's talk a little bit about employment hierarchy as I look at it when it comes to a safety culture and a safety program. Typically all starts with your host employer. Contractors are brought in, and as you know, regardless whether it's construction or manufacturing, there are all types of level contractors. There's a general contractor, there's a construction management, I should say a contractor management firm. Depending on how broad and how robust the program and project is, you could have anywhere from a few to a few hundred contractors performing on your job. Then we get into the whole subcontractor conversation, and that is a whole other area of concern. You're going to find that subcontractors present a whole other level of risk and attention that you need to include in your safety program and dialogue. And last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about staffing agencies and their temporary workers, because again, most incidents find that when it comes to fatalities, severe injuries, typically if you follow that food chain along, subcontractors and temp workers, unfortunately, tend to be the victims more often than not. So a host employer, and I want to let you know that these are OSHA definitions. Whenever we're talking about safety programs and we're throwing terms around, it's very helpful to understand that if a regulatory body has a definition of something, it's always best to go by that definition. If you talk to legal folks or risk folks, everybody may put their spin on it, but the world that I live in and the world that I come from, I try to go by regulatory definition. So a host employer typically has authority over the worksite, even if they're not self-performing. And that includes controlling and correcting safety and health hazards, having the authority to do that. I'm going to talk a few slides down about the categories of employer that OSHA has set forth. So if you happen to be a host employer listening in, typically you are going to fall under the correcting and or controlling employer definition. But if you look at the actual definition about having the means and manner to correct safety and health hazards, we're starting to talk about something called competent person definition as well. The second thing there is to have an established safety and health program, but also to make sure that your policies and procedures and programs align with your contractors and your staffing agencies. This is a very common problem that we see. We have a host employer that may or may not have a robust program. You have contractors coming on board, that same thing. They may or may not have robust programs, but the thing we try to do with gap analysis is look for conflicts. A perfect example of that might be the host employer has a policy that all workers on the project shall wear hard hats at all time. You also may have a contractor whose policy it is that their employees are only going to wear hard hats when a hazard presents itself to those employees. Well, you've got a conflict in policy. So those are the types of things that have to be discussed. They have to be hammered out. Everybody has to be on the same page. We don't want to find out until somebody is hurt or killed that there was a conflict in a safety and health policy. Another OSHA definition here for a contractor, an individual or firm. It is very important that you understand that a contractor does not have to have multiple employees. It can be a simple individual who perhaps even works on a 1099 basis that thinks of themselves as self-employed. But however, when they go to work for other contractors or host employers, they're under the full auspices of OSHA and their regulations. It is also important to know, and I'm sure that those folks listening in that do hire contractors, it is very common for them to outsource certain segments of work to subcontractors and temp workers. Why this presents a problem for safety and health personnel is because it is very, very tough to spot these folks when they are hired by a third or fourth party. We kind of call these ghost workers. They just kind of appear on the job. Nobody knows how they got there. They don't know who they came through, what gate they came through. So it's very important to have these discussions and include this in your contract wording that if you intend on hiring subcontractors and temp workers, you must notify the host employer of these folks or the intention to do this when you're going to do that. We don't, again, want to find out that people have been on our job for days, weeks, and months, and we haven't gotten a chance to communicate to them, have them orientated properly. And again, these are the folks that are going to get hurt more than others. Again, they present a greater risk because they are hired on a short-term notice, and typically they do not get the benefit of having that orientation to the site that most other workers do. Staffing agencies and temp workers, again, there are a lot of players out there in the staffing world. I'm sure you've heard of companies like WeWork, TechSource, Tradesman International. There are thousands of staffing agencies ranging from mom and pop companies all the way up to corporate conglomerate folks that handle thousands of workers, internationally. So these staffing agencies, I'm going to show you some OSHA initiatives that have happened over the last few years that typically staffing agencies really look to the host employers for safety and health responsibilities. You're going to find now that what's been happening in the industry is it's now a shared responsibility. Temp workers, that term again is used very loosely. I know temp workers that have been on the job for 3 years. So, what is the definition of temporary? But bottom line is most of these temp workers are usually hired through a staffing agency and they are placed at a host employer site, regardless, what the definition of temporary is. Those of you who have been on webinars with me before, this is kind of the go-to document that I point to for safety and health programs. Anytime that you are considering developing a safety and health program, maybe you're looking to do a little bit of checks and balances on your present safety and health program. This, for me, is a go-to publication from OSHA, recommended practices for safety and health programs. They also have a landing page, a host website that I have put a link in here. I'm not going to click on that. There's a lot of information in there, a lot of great information they've put in there. But one of the things I want to point out to you, whoops, I went a little bit too far ahead there. One of the things I want to point out to you is that they have a whole segment on communication and coordination for host employers, contractors, and staffing agencies, and how this is a shared responsibility. There's a lot of language in there about planning and documentation. And so if you are really wondering what the viewpoint is from OSHA on how a host employer needs to interact with contractors and staffing agencies. There's a great section in here on this publication. And, again, if you don't want to download the publication, you can also access the website for that information as well. This is something I had mentioned a little while ago about the initiatives from OSHA. Back in 2013, OSHA started their temporary worker initiative. This was obviously triggered by the spike in injuries, illnesses, and fatalities in those three industries of construction, agriculture, and manufacturing. Back in 2015, more than 6% of the severe injuries reported involved a temp worker, many within their first week on the job. So I just wanted you to be aware that there are a lot of initiatives out there for temp workers. I think a lot of this was due to the outreach, or I should say lack of outreach for temp workers. They just kind of fell into a kind of a black hole in between, the staffing agencies and the host employer about, do they have the same sort of rights and responsibilities when it comes to safety and health as full-time workers? And as you can see, these were some of the things that came out of that initiative. So they do have workers' rights. They have the same rights as full-time and part-time employees. There are specific injury and illness record-keeping responsibilities that are now shared between staffing agencies and host employers, as well as the overall safety and health responsibilities. Staffing agencies do have a role in inquiring into safety and health conditions on the site that they plan on placing that temporary worker in. And they have every right to go ahead and visit that site if they have concerns, if their workers report concerns. So I just want to make you aware that the staffing agency plays a much greater role now in the overall safety and health responsibility of those temp workers. And they have to work with the host employers jointly on this. So again, a lot of regulatory initiatives and information have come out on this. So please be aware that the OSHA Temporary Worker Initiative is out there. I talked a little while ago about, the life safety factor here. If someone's life isn't enough to convince you that safety culture, effective safety culture is so important, there's something else you need to be aware of from the regulatory standpoint is the OSHA multi-employer citation policy. I also mentioned when I was talking about host employers, that category of employment. You're going to see here that OSHA actually has established 4 categories of employer: the exposing employer, the creating employer, the correcting employer, and the controlling employer. And I had mentioned that the host employer typically falls under the correcting and controlling employer. But what the initiative is all about, what the citation policy is all about, is that any employer can be cited in any category. Sometimes they can be cited in all 4, depending on what's happened. Regardless if you are the exposing employer or the creating employer, somebody who's actually created the hazard, you can be cited in any of these categories. In situations where the employer's own employers are not exposed to a hazard, you can still be cited in those other 3 categories. So what OSHA is trying to understand is, even though someone has been hurt, injured, killed, one of the things that takes place is how much control or correcting power do any of these other employers have, be it a host employer or any level of contractor. And again, this is OSHA's way to make sure that nobody is just trying to step out of the responsibility role. And don't get me wrong, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of contractual language that's built into projects. OSHA does take that into consideration. If there's a host employer that relied fully on a contractor to mandate safety and health policy, to oversee those safety and health policies, to investigate, they will take that under consideration. But I don't know of a lot of examples where OSHA is just going to completely exonerate all the players, if you will. They really do a thorough job in making sure that if you had a role, no matter how big or how small, you're going to be held responsible for it. So again, another one of these pieces of regulatory information you need to be aware of when you're talking about contractors and temp workers. Let's talk a little bit about the pre-qualification process for contractors. And again, there are two parts here. There's pre-qualification and there's management. So I want to talk a little bit about historically what people tend to look for when they are going to be vetting contractors, or you're going to be considering a hiring pool of contractors. There's some information there that people have been using out there for years. Some of the pre-qualification checkpoints including obviously insurance requirements. You want to make sure your contractors have the level of insurance that they need to be involved with this project. EMR, experience modification rates. Those of you in the insurance and risk business know this language well. This was typically one of the big trigger points with hiring contractors. I got to tell you, EMR has taken a real black eye over the years. They find that experience modification rates, this is how it relates to workers' comp recordable rates. They're finding that a lot of these formulas that they use to calculate EMR, some of them aren't very accurate. Some of them are they have high exposure to corruption when it comes to reporting the data. And it's really not a level playing field depending on the size of your company. Typically, the formula that was calculated with experience mod meant that if you had anything over a 1.0 rating, you kind of fell into a higher category of risk, and most often that disqualified a contractor from performing for a host employer. I'm finding more and more now, though, EMR, even though that is still sort of a lagging indicator way of establishing criteria for a contractor, folks are getting away from that more and more, and they're looking toward other segments of information. OSHA recordable rates, these are where it's perfectly acceptable to ask an organization for a copy of the last 3 years OSHA 300A summary, not the actual log with names, but the actual summary itself. One of the I've highlighted a couple of things here that I have done for a number of years. I think right in line with OSHA recordable rates is OSHA violation history. A lot of people kind of look sideways at me when I ask that question. It is very, very easy to go on the OSHA website and go into an establishment criteria search for a name of a company. And you can go as far back as, 35, 40 years in there and find out about a company's OSHA violation history. As you know, whenever it comes to any sort of an incident that does trigger an OSHA investigation, if you are found liable for that, it's not just the monetary violations. It is you go in their database. Your name is in there. I don't know of any current way to get your name out of that. I don't know of any way. In other words, that just eventually goes away. Once you're in there, you're in there. The other thing that goes hand in hand with that is company name change history. Those are some of the questions you want to be asking your contractors. Have you always been known as ABC Contracting, or have you been known by other names? Reason why is because a lot of companies have caught on that once they're in that OSHA database, it's very, very simple to just go and change the name of your company, and it's very, very hard to link that company name back into the original name that appeared in the OSHA violation history. So those are two very important pieces of information that you should be including in your pre-qualification process if you're not doing it now. There are also some things, as I would call leading indicators as well. Background and DMV checks have become very standard. Drug and alcohol screening, whether or not the company does it now or they're going to be subject to a host employer screening. And then, of course, your overall documented safety and health program or your safety and health training program. Very important that you have a documented training program and a program in general, not just to say you conduct training. You have to have a way to document that program if it's an effective program, how you evaluate those programs, what are some of the trainer criteria. So it's not enough to just say your folks are trained. It's very important to also have a track record of an established and documented training program. I mentioned the other side of pre-qualification is ongoing management, okay? One of the first things I always make sure happens with any contractor, even a staffing agency, we have an ongoing safety and health point of contact. That doesn't necessarily need to be someone on the site or at the job location. This is perhaps somebody internally at that organization where any requirement, any incident that presents itself, you need to establish a safety and health point of contact. Very important that that happens. You don't want to get into the habit of talking to various people, having stories mixed up. You leave an action or a task up to one person, it never gets done. Very, very important to make sure that a point of contact is established right off the bat, and you have an ongoing point of contact as well. Hazard recognition and communication to the workforce and the host employer, that has to be continual. There's got to be open communication. We've got to talk to these folks. We've got to make sure that they understand their responsibilities on that job, not only to their own employees, but to the host employers and all other contractors that work on that job. You want to make sure that they are completing site safety plans, job hazard analysis, job task analysis. I know a lot of contractors, when they get on some of these jobs and they're being asked for this, the first thing I'll hear is, well, we've never done this before. Well, it should have never gotten to that point. That should have been part of pre-qualification. Do you have documented safety procedures and plans and job hazard analysis? You don't want to wait until somebody gets on the job and then they find out that these are requirements before they approach a certain task, especially if it's a high hazard task. You want to make sure that your contractors and temp workers are participating. That is a big word. They're not just part of, they're also participating in the program. We expect their participation and feedback in things like safety meetings and tailgate briefings. We want to make sure that we're hearing from them. It's an interactive process. Communication just isn't flowing from the host employer. We're getting continual feedback from our contractors and temp workers. And we want to make sure they understand that they have a voice in this. The proper use and training for personal protective equipment. That's another thing that we see a lot. Personal protective equipment, it's not just having it. It's not just having access to it, but it's also making sure that they've been trained on how to properly use that PPE. This is another big one here, dedicating time for contractor and temp worker relationship building. I work a lot with government contracts, Department of Defense, and a lot of these big DoD host employers and contractors, they call these user conferences. Typically once a year or twice a year, they invite all their contractors or intended contractors and staffing agencies, anybody who wishes to do business with this host employer, people that are currently doing business with this host employer. Some do it in person, some do it online, via webinars. It's just a great way to establish relationships with these folks. Again, if you're going to make a statement that your safety culture is effective, it goes beyond just having relationships with your employees. You've got to have positive relationship building that's going on with your contractors and temp workers as well. And also, very important that you make this an annual requalification. It does not help you if you have conducted pre-qualification 3, 4, 5 years ago and you haven't done it since. Things happen. Companies have financial issues. They lose their budgetary allotments. They may lose their insurance. They may lose workers that were part of their qualified workforce. So you want to make sure that this is a continual annual requalification. And for those of you listening in that are thinking that, wow, this is going to send a real ripple through my contractors and temp workers, folks, I understand this is not an easy thing to do. I was tasked with this a lot throughout my career. And I got to tell you, this can be a real, culture shock for your workforce. But I got to tell you, you just need to do it. You cannot turn a blind eye to this, and you've got to present this in making sure that there is an understanding mutually that you're doing this to not just for the safety culture aspect, for the regulatory aspect, for the contractual aspect. Again, you want to make sure that you are all growing and you're all making sure that safety is a very important part of your ongoing process. So again, a lot of folks are trying, they're thinking along the lines of, well, we just kind of weeding out the bad players here. Well, not so. We definitely want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on folks that aren't complying, that, just aren't making those types of investments. But we also want to help those folks that do want to make those investments and they do want to stay part of your active family and your active workforce. So again, this is an educational thing as well for companies that, are interested in learning about what they need to do to comply. I want to take a moment here to talk about training and orientations, a very commonly overlooked area. And I also want to dispel some of the myths out there about what is acceptable training. A lot of folks out there know about the OSHA 10 and 30-hour outreach training programs. These programs are available in construction. They're available in general industry. They're also available in maritime and I believe disaster recovery. I have been an OSHA 1030 construction outreach trainer coming up on 20 years. I cannot say enough about the program and its valuable resource for any worker or any employer. But there is something I need to point out about these programs. From the federal level, these are voluntary training programs. They do not meet any training requirement in any OSHA standard whatsoever. Some states, like my home state of Connecticut, have adopted the OSHA 10-hour program into worker requirements, especially when it comes to things like prevailing wage. There are a lot of cities that have adopted the OSHA 10 and 30-hour outreach program. A lot of employers have adopted it. It's gotten a lot of attention. The OSHA 10 and 30-hour outreach program has been around as long as OSHA has, since 1971. But what I do want to point out is simply being able to show an OSHA 10 or a 30 outreach card in no way, shape, or form means that that worker is qualified, certified, or authorized in any sort of hazard category. For that, we are looking to hazard-specific type training. Don't get me wrong, OSHA 10 and 30-hour training, it is great foundational baseline awareness training, but that is all it is. It is also an informational training program that informs workers about what their workers' rights are and how OSHA plays into it. They understand who OSHA is. We are looking at hazard-specific training. I'll give you an example. Very often I'll show up on job sites. I will see an electrician up on a roof, working up on a 4-story roof with a 6-foot pitch without fall protection. And the first thing that person will do is they'll show me an OSHA 10 card. That OSHA 10 card does not authorize that worker to be up on that roof working without fall protection. Even if they were working with fall protection, it doesn't mean that the OSHA 10-hour training has allowed them the proper training to understand the ins and outs and the information required in fall protection in order to actually work under those conditions. So we are looking at hazard-specific types of training. We're also looking at PPE-specific types of training. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about having personal protective equipment. It's also making sure that they have been trained on the use and maintenance and limitations on that PPE. The last part of this is what I call orientation type training. This is specific to the site that worker is going to be working at. Again, whether it's a construction site or a manufacturing facility or an industrial plant, you want to make sure that worker is familiarized. They are initiated into that site. This is where they need to know just the low-hanging fruit. What are we talking about? These are the areas you can go. These are the areas you can't go without an escort. They have to know about basic rules and regulations about the site. They have to know about emergency action planning. What if something happens? What if there is a fire? What if there is a need for an evacuation? Where do they go? Where are the emergency exits? Who are the assigned monitors? Emergency action planning, EAP, very, very important. Security check-in and check-out requirements, that's another area. I mean, we talk about this all the time. How do incidents happen? Very lax security, checkpoints. I can tell you I've been part of companies that have very, very strong and robust safety programs. The problem is when it comes right down to the boots on the ground at the site, security doesn't work hand in hand with their safety program. So whether that worker is going to require digital badging or some other sort of site, identification, this is another important part of site-specific orientation. And I do want to point out that orientations do not need to be very robust. There's a lot of companies out there, and I actually helped create some of these programs through e-learning. The orientation can sometimes be as little as 15 minutes or half an hour. The use of video is very, very powerful with site orientations. Also very powerful in introducing the safety team, introducing the safety, the safety mission statement, if you will. So orientation is a very crucial and powerful piece of training information that you need to implement. And I actually skipped one here at the end, incident reporting. Again, this kind of goes hand in hand with, if something does happen, who should I speak to? Who should I go to? What forms am I going to be required to fill out? Things of that nature. So again, those can all be wrapped up into a very good and effective orientation. And then of course we have specific training focus. Folks, whenever it comes to these are OSHA definitions, competent persons, qualified persons, certified persons, especially when it comes to high hazard work like electrical work, confined space work, maybe welding, any sort of hot work that happens, something that would require a certificate or a license. We want to make sure companies just aren't talking the talk. We want to make sure we're getting those records. So, it's not just enough to ask, are your employees trained? You need to see certificates. You need to see licenses. You need to see something, some sort of backup that says, yes, this person is trained and they are certified to operate that, that forklift. They are qualified at electrical work, depending on, what level of electrical work you're talking about, whether it's low voltage, high voltage. Are they competent? And when I say, are they competent, do they have the ability to recognize hazards as it's associated with that work? And do they have the power to correct those hazards? So we've got to be very careful. If we're going to be throwing these titles on folks, we've got to make sure that they have the training and the experience to back up those titles. So I am going to finish up the presentation by talking a little bit about technology, okay? As you can see, folks, when it comes to managing contractors and temp workers and staffing agencies, there's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of questions to ask. There's a lot of checks and balances. Some of the folks listening in may already have internally, established programs. You may have staff assigned to this that actually does this manually. You may have already employed technology within your company that actually takes some of this headache out of it for you, where you have boilerplates and you have systems and software that, develop these questions, develop some of the gap analysis that you need to be asking some of your folks out there in the contracting world and the staffing agency world. I do want to point out there's a lot of players out there with workforce management systems. Those of you may have recognized names like ISNetworld and Avetta. They've been around quite a long time. I think they were kind of pioneers in this industry with contractor pre-qualification. Again, some of these companies, they focus on pre-qualification. Some focus on the ongoing management. Some focus on both. Others also include things like training and mobile documents and document control within their systems. I just want to throw out a little shout out to TPC training. We do have a workforce management system as well. So by all means, if you are interested in learning more about some of these technologies, by all means, we can help you out with that. So please be aware that TPC does play in this area as well. Some of these workforce management systems, again, they have built-in pre-qualifying metrics. A lot of what I just spoke of, some of those questions you need to be asking your contractors. They have very robust record management features, where if you are talking about training records, OSHA recordable records, any sort of pre-qualifying metrics, these are great systems to record this data and to have it available when you need to run reports. Incident management, that's another great feature of some of these systems, where it can actually walk you through incidents, where from the conception, if somebody was hurt, if there was an incident concerning maybe a security breach, things of that nature, the incident management system can actually walk you through some of those initial steps and some of the follow-up management steps as well. I already mentioned some of the site-specific safety and health training and orientation requirements. Some of these systems are very sophisticated, where you can actually program a customized orientation that you can make available for your contractors and temp workforce. I talked about access management, how we need to establish some sort of security checkpoint. Maybe it's a photo ID card. You can actually keep a database of these contractors. And there's a perfect example. You can pull up kind of a profile on a worker. This is also mobile compatibility, where if somebody reported to a site that maybe the superintendent or the GC didn't recognize, they can actually go into this database, pull up that contractor, see that contractor's picture. So if you're worried about fraud, if you're worried about fraudulent, access to the site, this can be very beneficial as well. And another great feature of these technologies is these customized dashboards and reports they can generate. When I say customized dashboards, whenever we safety and health people are trying to talk to our hierarchy of executives and managers about, how are we doing, what's the overall, checkpoint of our safety and health program. A lot of senior management, they understand things like pie charts and graphs. So by really using some of these filters on these software programs, you can run custom reports. You can come out with custom graphs. If you're interested to find out, how many how many incidents resulted from falls in a given year, if you are looking at training requirements for your contractors, what are some of the gaps on those training? It's kind of neat. Some of these systems are very sophisticated. They're able to run all sorts of reports and show graphs and, pie charts and things like compliance gaps, training completions, even regulatory violations. So that is very, very helpful, especially when you need to procure this information very quickly. Those of you who are still on paper-based systems, and believe me, depending on the size of your company, I understand if you are still on a manual paper-based systems, two big things that tend to work against you is records management, where these records are being kept, how accessible these records are, and how quickly you can actually get some of this information in reportable form to where people can actually understand it. And that just not holds true for executives, managers, but that also holds true for regulatory authorities. When OSHA wants to see information, they don't want to wait days and weeks for, people to go through file cabinets of records that, haven't been touched in years. So these are some of the really nice features about implementing technology into your overall safety and health program, especially when it comes to contractor management. Well, I'm looking at my clock, and I hope I stayed on point. It's looking that we have about 10 minutes or so. Ryan, I don't know if any questions came in throughout the webinar, but as I mentioned at the top of the hour, I will be more than happy to address the questions I can right now if we have any, and if we either don't have any or they come in after the fact, I will do my best to answer any questions for you if you would leave your email address. So at this point, Ryan, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the information and for the discussion on safety culture in people's facilities. We do not have any questions at this time on the line, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for the day. Now, if any of you do want to ask any additional questions after this webinar is over, go ahead and give any inquiries to this email address right here, which is sales@tpctraining.com. This is kind of our main info line, main inquiry line, so feel free to use it to ask any sort of questions about training, about safety, about setting up a safety program, about using technology for your safety program, whatever you got. We got a bunch of experts, Paul included, that can really help you answer these questions. So thank you so much for being here with us, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.